Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, and thank you for being here tonight. Before we begin, I would like you to take a moment for yourself. Wherever you are right now, whatever the hour, allow yourself the quiet permission to rest. There is nothing else you need to do. There is nowhere else you need to be. The day, with all of its noise and all of its small demands, has already let you go, whether you have noticed it yet or not. Let your shoulders ease. Let your hands fall open gently, as though you have just set down something you have been carrying for a long time. If your jaw is tight, soften it. If your breath is shallow, let it deepen slowly, without effort, as though it remembered on its own how to fill you properly. You do not need to force anything at all. You do not need to concentrate. You do not even need to listen very carefully. Just let the words arrive, and if they carry you somewhere quiet, that is enough. Imagine, if you will, that the air around you has grown cooler, just slightly, the way it does on a clear winter night in England when the last of the daylight has long since gone, and the sky has settled into that deep, still darkness that belongs only to January. Imagine that somewhere nearby there is the faint, familiar smell of coal smoke, not harsh, but soft and rounded, the kind that drifts from chimneys on a windless evening and lingers in the lanes between old brick buildings. It is a smell that belongs to a particular time, a time when evenings were slower, when the world outside the window grew quiet much earlier than it does now, and when the simple fact of warmth inside a room was something to be grateful for. We're going to spend some time this evening in a place like that. A small, modest home above a shop in an English town on an ordinary winter night sometime in the early 1880s. Nothing extraordinary will happen here. No one will arrive unexpectedly. No urgent news will come. The evening will simply pass, as it always does, in the company of familiar things, and when it is finished, the room will still be there, and the fire will still be glowing in the grate, and the stillness will have settled so thoroughly that it will feel as though it had always been there, waiting for you to notice it. Let's go there now. The shop below had closed at 5:30, as it did every evening during the winter months. It was a modest establishment, a grocer shop of the kind that could be found on nearly any high street in nearly any English market town during those years. The sort of place that sold flour and sugar and tea by weight, and blocks of soap wrapped in brown paper, and tins of treacle lined up along the lower shelves behind a wooden counter worn smooth by decades of parcels and coins and the patient hands of customers. The shutters had been fastened across the plate glass window at the front, the heavy wooden panels slotted into their iron brackets with the same unhurried movements that had closed them every evening for years, and the bolt had been drawn across the shop door with a sound that was more felt than heard, a low, satisfying thud that marked the boundary between the working day and the private hours that followed it. Upstairs, in the rooms above the shop, the evening had already begun to settle into its own familiar shape. The staircase that connected the two was narrow and turned once at a small landing where a framed print of a country scene hung on the wall at a very slight angle. An angle so consistent and so long established that to straighten it would have felt wrong, would have introduced a small disturbance into the quiet order of the place. The stairs creaked in the same places they had always creaked, the third step and the seventh and the one just before the top, and these sounds were so thoroughly expected that they had long since ceased to be sounds at all, and had become instead simply part of the sensation of going upstairs, part of the way the body knew it was arriving home. At the top of the stairs there was a short passage, papered in a pattern of small green leaves against a cream ground. The paper darkened slightly near the ceiling where the warmth from the sitting room gathered during the winter months. To the left was the bedroom, its door half open, revealing only a thin strip of darkness and the pale edge of a cotton pillowcase catching what little light reached it from the passage. To the right was the kitchen, a small square room with a stone floor and a deal table pushed against the wall beneath a shelf that held a row of earthenware jars. And straight ahead, through a doorway whose frame had been painted and repainted so many times that the edges of the molding had grown soft and rounded, was the sitting room, and it was here that the evening was taking place. The room was not large, but it had been lived in so thoroughly and for so long that it had acquired the kind of completeness that only comes from years of the same person arranging the same objects in the same way. There was a cast iron fireplace on the wall opposite the door, its surround of dark green tiles chipped in two places, and in its grate a coal fire was burning with a steady, unhurried glow of a fire that has been tended carefully throughout the afternoon and has now reached that stage of the evening where it requires very little attention. The coals had settled into a deep, shifting arrangement of orange and gray, with here and there a brighter vein of heat where one piece rested against another, and every so often a faint sound would come from the grate, a soft click or a quiet hiss, as a fragment of coal adjusted its position or released a thin thread of gas that caught the flame and burned for a moment with a small, blue-edged flicker before vanishing. Above the fireplace there was a mantelpiece of dark wood, and upon it sat a clock. It was a modest clock, housed in a case of walnut that had been polished so often and for so many years that it held a deep luster, the kind that seemed to contain the light of every lamp and every fire that had ever burned in that room. The clock's face was cream, with Roman numerals painted in a thin, precise black, and its minute hand moved with a motion so slow and so smooth that it was nearly impossible to observe unless one watched it for a long time. The ticking was constant, and it filled the room in the way that a heartbeat fills a body, not loudly, not insistently, but so thoroughly present that its absence would have been a kind of silence almost too deep to bear. On either side of the clock, two brass candlesticks stood, unlit, their presence merely decorative at this hour, their surfaces catching the shifting light from the fire and holding in small, curved reflections that moved and changed with every flicker of the coals. The paraffin lamp on the table near the window was the room's only other source of light. It was a duplex burner, the kind with two flat wicks set close together beneath a clear glass chimney, and above the chimney sat an opaque glass shade, slightly yellowed with age, that softened and diffused the light so that it fell across the table and the nearest chair in a warm, even glow that did not quite reach the corners of the room. The lamp had been lit perhaps an hour earlier, with the careful, practiced movements of someone who has performed the same action many hundreds of times. The chimney lifted, the wicks trimmed, the match struck and held steady until both wicks caught, the chimney replaced, and then the small brass will turned slowly until the flame was adjusted to exactly the right height, not so low that it guttered and smoked, and not so high that it consumed the paraffin too quickly or through too strong a light. The flame, visible through the glass chimney as a soft, doubled line of amber, burned with a steadiness that seemed almost contemplative, as though it, too, had found its place in the evening's quiet arrangement and was content to remain there. There was a woman in the room, seated in a chair beside the fire. She was perhaps 50, perhaps a little older, though the lamplight was kind to her face and smoothed away the years in a way that the sharper light of morning would not have done. She wore a dark dress of plain wool, the sort of dress that a shopkeeper's wife might wear on an ordinary evening when there was no company expected and no reason to change from the practical clothing of the working day. A shawl of gray knitted wool lay across her shoulders, and her hands rested in her lap, one holding a small piece of sewing, the other lying open upon her knee. She was not sewing at that moment. She was simply sitting, looking at the fire in the way that people looked at fires in those days, which is to say, with a kind of patient, unfocused attention that was not quite thought and not quite sleep, but something restful that lay between the two, a state of being that the fire itself seemed to encourage with its slow, changing colors and its gentle, unpredictable sounds. The chair in which she sat was upholstered in a fabric that had once been a rich plum color, but had faded over the years to a softer shade, the color of dried lavender. And its arms were protected by antimacassars of white cotton lace that she had made herself years ago and that she washed and starched and replaced on the chair arms every few weeks with a quiet precision that was less about cleanliness than it was about the satisfaction of keeping things as they ought to be. The chair had a particular quality that certain well-used chairs develop over many years, a quality of having absorbed the shape and the weight and the habits of its owner so thoroughly that it seemed almost to hold her, to know where her elbows would rest and where her head would lean back and how her feet would settle, slightly apart, upon the small, threadbare rug before the hearth. The rug was a braided affair, made from strips of old fabric, and it lay on the floor between the fire and the chair like a quiet island of softness on the bare boards. Beyond the rug, the floorboards stretched to the walls, their surfaces darkened with age and with the application, over many years, of beeswax polish, so that they held a dull gleam in the firelight that made them look almost liquid in the warmer patches near the grate. The boards were not perfectly level. There was a slight dip near the window, and a place near the door where one board had risen just enough to catch the edge of a slipper if one was not careful. And these small imperfections were as familiar to the woman as the features of her own face, were in fact part of the room's character, part of what made it hers. Against the wall to the left of the fireplace, there was a small bookcase, not tall, rising only to the height of the woman's shoulder when she stood beside it. Its shelves held a modest collection of volumes, most of them bound in cloth covers of brown or green, their spines faded and in some cases slightly frayed. There was a Bible, of course, its cover thicker and more worn than the others, and beside it a copy of Mrs. Beeton's household management book, and a few novels, and a volume of poetry, and one or two issues of a periodical that had arrived months ago and had never been discarded because there was an article in one of them that she meant to finish reading one day. The books were arranged not by any system of classification, but by the order in which they had found their places on the shelves over the years. The earlier arrivals pushed toward the back, the more recent ones standing at the front. And this arrangement, too, had the settled, permanent quality of something that has not been disturbed for a long time and does not need to be. On the wall above the bookcase hung a small framed watercolor of a harbor scene, the kind of modest painting that might have been purchased at a seaside town during a holiday visit years ago. The colors had faded, and the glass was in need of cleaning, but the painting remained on the wall in its place because it had always been there, and because the faint, washed-out blues of the sea and the sky still carried, for the woman who glanced at it from time to time, without quite seeing it, some faint residue of the day on which it was bought, some half-remembered feeling of salt air and the sound of gulls and the particular lightness that belongs to a day spent away from home. The window of the sitting room looked out onto the street below, though at this hour and in this season there was very little to see. The curtains were drawn, heavy curtains of a dark fabric that might have been green or might have been brown. It was difficult to tell in the lamplight, and they hung in deep folds from a brass rail, their hems just touching the floor. They were lined as curtains in a properly kept Victorian home always were, with a thicker material that served to keep out the drafts that found their way through the gaps in the sash window frame. And when the wind blew, which it did from time to time on this particular evening, the curtains moved very slightly, a barely perceptible stirring along their lower edges, as though they were breathing. Behind the curtains, the window panes were cold to the touch. In the lower corners, small patches of condensation had formed where the warm air of the room met the frozen glass, and these patches glistened faintly if one drew the curtain back, though there was no reason to draw the curtain back, and no one did. The street below was quiet. It was a Wednesday evening in late January, and the lamplighter had already passed, so the gas lamps along the pavement cast their familiar pools of yellow light at regular intervals, and between those pools the darkness was deep and still, broken only occasionally by the sound of footsteps passing or the distant clatter of a horse and cart on the cobblestones of the high street, a sound that grew and faded and was gone, leaving behind it a silence that felt somehow deeper than the silence that had preceded it. Inside the room, the fire shifted. A piece of coal that had been balanced on another piece for some time finally gave way and settled lower into the grate with a soft, crumbling sound, sending up a brief scatter of sparks that rose and died in the space of a breath. The woman looked at the fire. She considered, for a moment, whether to add more coal. The scuttle sat beside the hearth, a black iron vessel with a curved handle, and inside it were enough pieces of coal to last the evening if she was careful, if she added a piece now and perhaps another in an hour, and then, before bed, banked the fire with the smaller pieces and the coal dust that had settled at the bottom of the scuttle, so that the embers would hold until morning and spare her the trouble of lighting a new fire from scratch. She reached for the scuttle, lifted it by its handle, and with the small, flat-bladed shovel that hung from a hook on the fireplace surround, she placed 2 pieces of coal, one at a time, onto the glowing bed of embers. She did this without hurry, choosing each. The teapot sat upon a wooden tray, a round, brown teapot of glazed earthenware, its surface smooth and warm to the touch even before the tea was made, because it had been sitting in the warm room for some time. Beside it stood a caddy of tin, painted with a design of flowers that had mostly worn away, leaving only faint suggestions of color against the dark metal. Inside the caddy, the tea leaves waited, dry and dark and fragrant, with a scent that was released each time the lid was lifted, a scent that was part of the evening's ritual, part of the sequence of small actions that led from the closing of the shop to the quiet hours before bed. There was a cup and saucer, too, of plain white china with a thin blue line around the rim, and a small milk jug, and a sugar basin with a lid, and a teaspoon that lay across the saucer with its handle pointing toward the right, because that was where she always placed it, and because the placement of a teaspoon upon a saucer was one of those things that, once established in a particular way, never changed. She went to the hearth and lifted the kettle, using the folded cloth to protect her hand from the hot handle, and she carried it to the table, where she poured a little of the boiling water into the teapot and swirled it gently to warm the pot, a step that she performed every time she made tea, and that she would have considered it careless to omit. She emptied the warming water into a small basin, then spooned the tea leaves into the pot, 2 spoonfuls, measured with the same small caddy spoon that had been used for this purpose for as long as she could remember, a spoon whose bowl had been slightly bent at some point in the past, and had remained bent ever since, because it still worked perfectly well, and there was no reason to replace it. The boiling water went in next, poured from the kettle in a thin, steady stream that darkened as it met the leaves and sent up a cloud of steam that rose and swirled and caught the lamplight for a moment before dissolving. She placed the lid on the teapot and set it back upon the tray, and then she carried the kettle back to the hearth and set it upon the trivet once more, where it would keep warm in case she wanted a second cup later in the evening, though she rarely did. The tea needed a few minutes to steep, and she used this time as she always used it, standing by the table, doing nothing in particular, simply waiting in the way that one waits for something that is certain to come. She looked at the curtains and noticed that the draft from the window was stirring the lower edge of the left curtain very slightly, a movement so small that it would have been invisible to anyone not standing exactly where she was standing, at exactly this angle, in exactly this light. She reached out and adjusted the curtain, pulling it a fraction of an inch closer to the wall, and the movement stopped, and she felt a faint, almost imperceptible satisfaction, the kind that comes from setting a small thing right. When the tea had steeped long enough, she poured it into her cup through a small wire strainer that caught the leaves and held them in a neat, dark mound that she would later empty into the kitchen basin. She added milk from the jug, watching as it sank through the dark tea and rose again in slow, pale clouds that gradually lightened the whole cup to the color of autumn oak leaves. She added a small quantity of sugar, stirred it with a teaspoon, and carried the cup and saucer back to her chair, where she settled herself once more, the saucer resting on the arm of the chair, the cup held lightly in both hands, and the warmth of it passing through her fingers and into her palms and up along her wrists in a slow wave that was as familiar and as welcome as the first breath of air on stepping outside on a spring morning. She drank the tea slowly, in small sips, as she always did, not because she was savoring it in any deliberate way, but because this was simply the pace at which she drank tea, the pace at which the evening unfolded, the pace at which time passed in this room on a winter night, when there was nowhere to go and nothing that required doing, and the only measure of the hour was the clock on the mantelpiece, whose ticking had by now receded so far into the background of her awareness that it might have been the sound of her own pulse. Outside, the wind pressed against the window with a soft, sustained sound, like a hand laid flat against the glass. It was not a strong wind, not the kind that rattled the panes or whistled through the gaps in the frame, but a steady, cold presence that could be felt in the faint chill that lingered near the window and in the way the curtains moved very slightly, in a slow rhythm that had no particular pattern and that would stop and start again without warning. The wind brought with it the sound of the street, muffled and distant, as though the world outside were wrapped in cloth. There was the occasional clop of hooves on cobblestones, growing closer and then receding, the iron shoes ringing out a rhythm that was both regular and slightly uneven, the way a horse moves when it is tired at the end of a long day and is being walked home rather than driven. There is the fainter sound of voices, too far away to make out any words, just the rise and fall of conversation carried on the cold air, the sound of someone speaking and someone else replying, and then silence, and then the voices again, further away now, diminishing, until they were absorbed into the general quiet of the night. Inside the room, the fire had found its rhythm. The new coal had caught fully now, and the flames moved among the pieces with a slow, almost drowsy restlessness, rising and falling, turning from orange to yellow to a pale, translucent blue at their base, where the heat was most intense. The light they cast moved across the walls and the ceiling in soft, shapeless patterns that shifted and changed with the changing of the flames, and these patterns were the room's own quiet entertainment, its own private display, visible to no one but the woman in the chair, who watched them without watching them, who saw them without seeing them, in the way that one sees the familiar things of one's own home, which is to say with the eyes open, but the attention elsewhere, resting somewhere. Between thought and the absence of thought, the clock struck the half-hour. It was not a loud sound, just a single, clear chime that seemed to come from inside the walnut case, and a hang in the air for a moment after the mechanism had finished, a small vibration that the ear could feel rather than hear, and then it was gone, and the ticking resumed, and the room absorbed the interruption as it absorbed everything quietly without fuss. The way a pond absorbs a pebble and then closes over the place where it fell and becomes smooth again. The woman's sewing lay on the arm of the chair where she had left it, the needle still tucked through the fabric, the thread trailing in a short, loose line. She did not pick it up again. Instead, she sat with her tea, and her eyes moved around the room in a slow, unconscious circuit that took in the familiar objects one by one, not examining them, not thinking about them, just acknowledging their presence in the way that one acknowledges the presence of old friends who require no conversation and no particular attention, only the quiet comfort of being near. The wallpaper, she noticed, was beginning to show its age in the corner nearest the window, where the dampness that crept in during the wettest months had left a faint stain, barely visible in the lamplight, that spread in a shape like the coast of a map she had once seen in a schoolbook. She had noticed this stain many times before and had considered, vaguely, the possibility of having the room repapered, but the thought never progressed beyond the noticing, because the wallpaper was otherwise perfectly serviceable, and because the room with different paper would not quite be the same room, and she preferred it as it was. On the table beside the lamp, there was a small stack of items that had accumulated over the course of several days and that she had been meaning to sort through. There was a letter from her sister in Dorset, received 3 days ago and read twice and not yet answered, its envelope propped against the base of the lamp with a kind of careful placement that suggested it was being kept in view as a reminder. There was a newspaper folded to the page she had been reading the previous evening, a page that contained a column about the weather and a short notice about a lecture to be given at the town hall on the subject of domestic hygiene, and an advertisement for a brand of cocoa that she had never tried. There was a pair of spectacles in a case of worn leather, and a pencil, and a small notebook in which she kept a record of the household accounts, the daily expenditure on food and coal and lamp oil, and the dozen other necessities that kept a modest household running from one week to the next. She did not reach for any of these things. They would still be there tomorrow, and tomorrow she would attend to them, or she would not, and either way they would remain on the table beside the lamp, patient and undisturbed, because the things in this room had learned the same lesson that the woman herself had learned over the years, which was that most things could wait, and that the waiting was not a burden, but a kind of rest. a pause in the endless procession of tasks and obligations that filled the waking hours. The tea was growing cool in the cup. She could feel the change in its temperature through the china, the warmth receding slowly from her fingers, and she drank the last of it in 2 long sips and placed the empty cup upon the saucer with a sound so slight, so perfectly controlled, that it was less a sound than a sensation, the faintest possible contact of china against china, like a breath. She sat for a while with the empty cup on the arm of the chair, her hands resting on either side of it, and she looked at the fire. The coals had arranged themselves into a small, glowing landscape, a geography of light and shadow that seemed, in the way that fires always seem, to contain within it the shapes of things that were not quite there, the suggestion of buildings or hills or faces that formed and dissolved and reformed in the ceaseless movement of the heat. She did not try to see these shapes. She simply let her eyes rest upon the fire, and her thoughts, which had been hovering somewhere just behind her attention all evening, grew quieter, and the distance between her and the room around her seemed to shrink, so that she felt herself to be not a person sitting in a chair looking at a fire, but simply part of the room itself, one of its objects, as settled and as still as the clock on the mantelpiece or the books on the shelf or the old watercolor in its frame. The wind outside had eased. The curtains hung motionless, and the cold patch of air near the window seemed to have drawn back, as though the room's warmth had finally reached even the furthest corners and filled them. The street below was silent now, or nearly so. There might have been, if she had listened very carefully, the faint sound of a dog barking somewhere several streets away, or the distant chime of a church clock marking the 3/4 hour. But these sounds, if they existed at all, were so far removed from the room and from the evening and from the soft, enclosing stillness that they might as well have been sounds from another year, another town, another life entirely. She thought, without quite thinking it, that she should make up the fire before bed. The thought arrived the way such thoughts always arrived at this hour, not as a decision, but as a gentle prompt from the body, from the long habit of evenings that had taught her when it was time to begin the slow sequence of small actions that led from the chair to the bed. She was not ready yet. The fire still had warmth enough, and the lamp still burned, and the room was still holding her in its quiet embrace, and there was no reason to hurry. She reached for her shawl and pulled it a little closer around her shoulders. The wool was soft against her neck, and the gesture of tightening it was so habitual, so thoroughly a part of her evening routine, that she was barely aware of having done it. Her fingers found the edge of the shawl and folded it under, the way they always did, and then her hands returned to her lap, and she was still again. The lamp flame flickered, just once, a small tremor in the otherwise steady light, caused perhaps by a tiny imperfection in one of the wicks or by some imperceptible movement of air within the room. The flicker sent a brief, soft shadow across the ceiling and was gone, and the lamp resumed its patient, even glow, and the room, which had seemed for that fraction of a moment to lean forward, to stir in its sleep, settled back into its accustomed quiet. Time passed. It is difficult to say how much time, because in a room like this, on an evening like this, time did not move in the way it moved elsewhere. It did not march or hurry or accumulate. It simply existed, like the air, like the warmth, like the faint smell of coal smoke and paraffin and the distant, almost imaginary scent of the tea leaves that still clung to the inside of the pot. Minutes passed, perhaps many minutes, and the woman sat, and the clock ticked, and the fire burned, and the lamp glowed, and nothing happened, and nothing needed to happen, and the nothing that happened was not emptiness but fullness, the fullness of a room that contained everything it needed and wanted nothing more. She became aware, gradually, of the weight of her own eyelids. It was not sleepiness exactly, not yet, but the first intimation of it, the way the body signals, gently and without urgency, that the day is nearing its end. Her breathing had slowed without her noticing, and her hands, which had been resting lightly on the arms of the chair, had grown heavier, the fingers curling slightly inward, relaxing into a shape that was neither open nor closed, but somewhere between, the natural position of hands at rest. The fire made a sound. It was a sound so small and so specific that it would have been impossible to describe to anyone who had not heard it, a sound that was part crackle and part sigh, the sound of a piece of coal finally surrendering its last reserves of heat and collapsing gently into the bed of ash beneath the grate. A small plume of fine gray dust rose from the grate and drifted upward toward the chimney, and the remaining coals glowed a little more brightly for a moment, as though the removal of their companion had given them more room to breathe, and then they dimmed again, settling into their slow, steady decline. The woman stirred. She placed her hands on the arms of the chair and pushed herself upright, and then she stood, and the room seemed, for a moment, to rearrange itself around her, the shadows shifting, the proportions changing, as though the act of standing had altered her relationship to everything in it. She was taller than the room expected, or the room was smaller than she remembered, or the ceiling was lower, or the fire was further away, and these small dislocations lasted only an instant before the room settled back into its familiar dimensions, and she was herself again, standing beside her chair, looking at the fire, deciding what to do next. She went first to the window. She did not draw back the curtain, but she placed her hand flat against it, pressing gently, and through the heavy fabric she could feel the cold of the glass on the other side, a deep, still cold that spoke of frost and frozen puddles and the particular silence that descends upon a town when the temperature drops below a certain point and the air itself seems to thicken and grow still. She held her hand there for a moment, feeling the cold, and then she withdrew it and turned back to the room. The fire needed banking. She knew this without deciding it, the way she knew that the shop needed sweeping each morning and the bread needed ordering on Tuesdays and the rent was due on the first of the month. It was simply part of the order of things, part of the pattern that held the days together and gave each evening its shape. She knelt before the hearth, her knees settling onto the braided rug with a familiar softness, and she took the small shovel from its hook and began to gather the fine coal and the dust from the bottom of the scuttle, spreading it carefully over the glowing embers, covering them gently, the way one might draw a blanket over a sleeping child. The effect was immediate. The flames, which had been moving among the coals in their slow, drowsy dance, retreated, diminished, flickered once or twice, and then subsided, and the bright orange glow of the embers was gradually covered by a layer of dark dust that smothered it without extinguishing it entirely. Beneath the covering, the heat would hold through the night, and in the morning, when she came down to the sitting room in her dressing gown and her slippers, she would be able to coax the fire back to life with a few careful movements of the poker and a handful of kindling, and the room would warm again, and the day would begin as it always began. With the sound of the fire catching and the kettle being filled and the shutters of the shop below being unbolted and folded back to reveal the plate glass window and the street beyond. But that was morning, and morning was a long way off, and the night was here, and the room was warm, and the banked fire still gave off enough heat to keep the chill at bay for a few hours yet. She rose from her knees, brushing a trace of coal dust from her fingers with the small cloth, and she stood before the fireplace for a moment, looking at the mantelpiece, at the clock, at the candlesticks, at the small china figure of shepherdess that sat between them, a figure so familiar and so long resident in that spot that it had become almost invisible to her, noticed only in moments like this. When the evening had wound down to its final stages and her attention, freed from the demands of the day, drifted over the room's contents like a hand passing over the surface of still water. The shepherdess had been a gift, she recalled, though from whom and on what occasion she could no longer quite remember. It might have been a birthday present from her mother, or something purchased at a church bazaar, or a small token brought home from a visit to a relative in another town. The uncertainty did not trouble her. The figure's history was less important than its presence. The simple fact of its being there, on the mantelpiece between the candlesticks, where it had stood for years, its painted smile unchanged, its tiny porcelain crook held in a hand no larger than a grain of rice. She looked at it now, for a few seconds, and then her eyes moved on, past the clock, past the dim reflection of the firelight in the dark tiles of the surround, past the poker and the tongs that hung on their hooks in the companion stand, and she turned away and crossed the room to attend to the lamp. Lowering the lamp was another of the evening's final rituals, one of the last in the sequence that led from waking to sleeping. She approached the table and reached for the small brass wheel on the side of the burner, and she turned it very slowly, and the twin flames inside the glass chimney shrank, their amber light diminishing by degrees, the room's shadows deepening and drawing inward as the light retreated, until the flames were barely there at all, two thin, blue-edged threads that danced just above the surface of the wicks and threw only the faintest possible light, enough to see by if one already knew where. Everything was, which she did, because this room in the dark was as familiar to her as this room in the light, and the darkness was not an obstacle, but merely a change of condition. The way silence is not the opposite of sound, but merely its absence. She did not extinguish the lamp entirely. She would carry it with her to the bedroom, as she always did, its reduced flame sufficient to light the short walk along the passage, to illuminate the bedroom doorway and the edge of the bed and the nightstand where she would set it down and turn the wheel one final time, bringing the flames to nothing and letting the darkness close in around her like a soft, heavy curtain drawn shut. But she was not ready to leave the sitting room yet. There were still a few small things to attend to, the kind of things that took almost no time, but that could not be left undone, because they were part of the order, part of the pattern, and to omit them would have been to leave a thread hanging loose in the fabric of the evening, and she was not the sort of person who left threads hanging loose. She carried the empty teacup and saucer to the kitchen. The passage was dim, lit only by the faint glow from the sitting room behind her, and her slippers made a soft, sliding sound on the bare boards as she walked. The kitchen was dark and cold, and she did not light a candle but simply set the cup and saucer in the stone sink by feel, her hands finding the edge of the sink and the smooth, curved surface of the basin with the certainty of long practice. She would wash them in the morning. For now, It was enough that they were in their proper place, waiting. She paused in the kitchen for a moment, standing in the darkness, and she became aware of the particular quality of silence that the kitchen possessed at this hour, a silence different from the silence of the sitting room, which was softened by the fire and the clock and the lingering warmth of the lamp. The kitchen silence was harder, cooler, more complete. It was the silence of stone and iron and water standing still in a jug on the shelf. The silence of a room that would not be used again until morning, that had surrendered itself entirely to the night and was waiting, as the cup and the saucer were waiting, for the day to begin again. She returned to the sitting room. The fire, beneath its covering of cold dust, was invisible now, or nearly so. Only a faint, dull glow showed here and there through the covering, a reddish hint of the heat that still lived beneath, like the last traces of sunset visible through heavy cloud. The room had grown slightly cooler in the few minutes she had been away, not cold, but no longer warm in the same immediate, encompassing way it had been earlier. The coolness was not unpleasant. It was the room's way of saying that the evening was truly over, that the time for sitting and watching and resting had passed, and that the next part of the night, the part that belonged to sleep, was ready to begin. She gathered her sewing from the arm of the chair and placed it in the small basket that sat on the floor beside the bookcase. The basket in which she kept her needles and her thread and her scissors and the various half-finished pieces of mending that accumulated over the course of a week. The handkerchief with its nearly completed repair went in on top, the needle still tucked through the fabric, the thread still attached, everything left exactly as it was, ready to be taken up again tomorrow evening or the evening after that, whenever the mood came upon her, whenever the rhythm of the evening brought her to that particular place in the sequence where the sewing seemed to belong. She folded the cloth she used for wiping her hands and laid it on the arm of the chair. She straightened the antimacassars, running her fingertips along their edges, smoothing the lace flat against the faded plum of the upholstery. She pushed her sister's letter a fraction of an inch closer to the base of the lamp, aligning its edge with the edge of the newspaper beneath it. These are not tasks. They were gestures, the small, final gestures of a person preparing to leave a room that she loved, a room that she would return to in the morning and find exactly as she had left it, because nothing in this room moved of its own accord, and the objects that filled it were as faithful and as permanent as the walls themselves. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, her hands at her sides, her shawl still around her shoulders. The clock ticked. The banked fire held its breath beneath its covering of dust. The lamp on the table burned low, its reduced flame casting a circle of light that reached no further than the table's edge, beyond which the room fell away into a soft, brownish darkness that was not quite dark, because the embers behind their covering still gave off the faintest possible glow, a warmth of color rather than of light, that touched the lower walls and the edge of the hearth rug and the curved leg of the chair, and nothing more. She listened. It was not a deliberate act of listening, not the kind one performs when expecting to hear something in particular. It was more a kind of openness, a willingness to receive whatever sounds the room and the night chose to offer. And the sounds were these: the clock, ticking, regular and unvarying; the faint, almost inaudible hiss of the lamp flame consuming the last of the paraffin that clung to the wicks; the creak of a floorboard somewhere in the passage, caused not by any footstep but by the contraction of the wood as the temperature in the unheated passage dropped; And beneath all of these, so faint that it might have been imagined, the sound of the wind, far away now, touching the roof of the building above her with a sound like a palm brushing across the surface of a drum, a sound so gentle and so brief that it was gone before it could be fully identified, leaving behind it only the impression of having been heard. She reached for the lamp. She lifted it by its brass handle, and the light moved with her, sliding across the surface of the table, across the folded newspaper and the letter and the spectacle case, and then lifting free of them as she raised the lamp and held it at her side. The room behind her fell into deeper shadow, and the room ahead of her, the passage, received the light as she stepped through the doorway, the green-leafed wallpaper momentarily bright, the framed print on the landing momentarily visible, the stairs below momentarily lit, and then dark again as she passed. The bedroom was cold. It was always cold in winter because there was no fireplace in this room, and the warmth from the sitting room, which traveled along the passage and through the open doorway, was never quite enough to take the chill from the air, especially on a night like this when the temperature outside had been dropping since early afternoon and the frost was already forming on the window panes. But the bed, when she reached it and drew back the heavy counterpane and the woolen blankets beneath, was not cold. She had placed a stone-hot water bottle between the sheets an hour ago, wrapped in a piece of flannel, and the warmth of it had spread through the bed in a slow, invisible circle, so that when she placed her hand on the sheet, she felt the warmth at once, stored and waiting, patient as the room itself, patient as the whole evening had been, ready to receive her. She set the lamp on the nightstand. The bedroom was small, smaller than the sitting room, and it contained only the essential things: the bed, the nightstand, a washstand with a basin and a jug of water, a wardrobe of dark wood with a mirror in its door that caught the lamplight and sent it back in a long, distorted reflection that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. On the nightstand, beside the lamp, there was a glass of water and a small devotional book that she read a page of every night before sleep, though some nights she read only a few lines and other nights she read none at all, because the act of opening the book and resting it on her chest was itself enough, was itself a kind of reading, a kind of prayer, a way of marking the boundary between the evening and the night. She removed her shawl and folded it and laid it on the foot of the bed. She unpinned her hair, which she had worn all day in a simple arrangement at the back of her head, and it fell to her shoulders, and she ran her fingers through it once and let it be. She changed in her nightgown, a plain garment of white cotton that had been laundered so many times that it was as soft as silk, and she hung her dress on the hook inside the wardrobe door and closed the door, and the mirror swung gently, and the lamplight swung with it, and the room swayed for a moment, and then was still. She sat on the edge of the bed. The springs beneath the mattress made a single, low sound, a note almost too deep to hear, that resonated for a moment and then faded. She reached for the devotional book and opened it, but she did not read. She held it in her hands, its pages open to whatever place the book had chosen to fall open to, and she looked at the words without reading them. And the words looked back at her, patient and familiar, offering nothing that she did not already know. She closed the book and set it back on the nightstand. She reached for the lamp. The small brass wheel turned beneath her fingers, and the flame shrank, the twin wicks drawing down into their housing, the glass chimney darkening, the room's shadows reaching inward, and then the flame was gone, and the darkness was complete, and the room was no longer a room, but a feeling, a temperature, a collection of familiar shapes that the mind assembled from memory rather than from sight. She drew the blankets up to her chin. The warmth of the hot water bottle was still there, radiating through the sheets, surrounding her feet and her legs and the small of her back with a gentle, steady heat that seemed to have no particular source, but simply to exist the way the warmth of the fire existed, the way the warmth of the tea existed, the way all warmth existed in this life, as a gift that arrived without being asked for and departed without being noticed, until its absence reminded one of how much one had depended on it. The pillow was cool against her cheek for a moment, and then it warmed as everything warmed in time, and she settled her head into it, finding the slight hollow that her head had made in it over many nights of sleeping in exactly this position, on her right side, with her knees drawn up slightly and her hands folded beneath her chin. The bed held her. The darkness held her. The room, with its invisible walls and its invisible ceiling and its silent, sleeping furniture, held her. The sounds of the night reached her from a great distance now. The clock in the sitting room was still ticking. She knew, though she could not hear it from the bedroom, or perhaps she could, very faintly, if she listened with the part of her mind that was still awake, the small, diminishing part that had not yet surrendered to the heaviness in her limbs and the warmth of the blankets and the soft, slow rhythm of her own breathing. The clock was ticking, and the banked fire was glowing beneath its covering, and the lamp on the sitting room table was dark now, and the teapot on the tray was cold, and the sewing was in its basket, and the books were on their shelves, and the watercolor of the harbor was hanging on its wall, and everything was where it should be, everything was as it should be, and the night was long and dark and still, and the house was quiet, and she was warm, and she was home. Somewhere far away, so far away that it might have been a sound from another evening altogether, a church bell struck the hour. The single, deep note traveled through the cold air and through the walls of the building and through the drawn curtains and the darkened rooms until it reached her, and by the time it reached her it was no longer a sound, but a vibration, a pulse, a soft disturbance at the very edge of awareness that lasted for a moment and then was gone, absorbed into the general quiet of the night, into the deep and patient silence that had been waiting all evening for this moment, the moment when the house and the woman and the darkness were finally one, and the evening was over, and sleep had come, as it always came, gently, without announcement, without ceremony, settling over her the way the cold dust had settled over the embers, slowly, softly, completely, until there was nothing left but warmth and stillness and the long, unhurried passage of the night. And so we will leave her there, resting in the quiet of that small room above the shop, in the warmth of her blankets, in the company of all the familiar, faithful things that make a home. The evening has passed as evenings passed in those days, slowly and without event, and the night has arrived as nights arrived, gently and without fuss, and the world outside the window is cold and dark and still, and there is nothing left to do and nothing left to say. And if you too are feeling the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, if you too are feeling the quiet pull of sleep, then let it come. Let it settle over you the way it has settled over this room, this house, this street. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you need to be. Thank you so much for spending time here. It was a real pleasure to share this peaceful evening with you. If you enjoyed relaxing in this tranquil place, We always look forward to your return. You might consider joining us by subscribing, so that on your next peaceful night, another story awaits you here. And if you wish, you can leave a quiet word, just a thought, or a good night wish below. No ruse. Sleep well, and we'll see you again soon. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.